My day started out like any other. I was taking a nap under the apple tree when all of a sudden I had an idea. I wondered if there was a way to make these apples into delicious apple cider. So naturally, I ran in the house, grabbed a cup, and started squeezing. But that didn't really work out too well. But if at first you don't succeed, grab a big old hammer and try again. But that was really messy, and I really didn't get any juice. So there was only one thing left to try. I called Craig, who was an amazing golfer. I figured if anybody could help me out with my problem, it would be him. But all that really did was get me all sticky and gross. So I went into my office and I got on the internet to do a little research. And I actually found these old antique cider presses which looked awesome. Basically, they have this machine that chunks up the apples into a bucket. You slide that forward, and then this whole pressing screw thing presses out the apples, and the juice comes out. The only problem is I need all these metal parts, which I didn't have. So I got on the internet and I searched metal apple parts. And I found a bunch of weird watches. So then I changed my search to metal apple press parts, and I found more what I was looking for. I actually found a website called Happy Valley Ranch that sells all of the metal parts I need to make my own press. So let's quit talking about it and let's go make a press. Now, as far as I could tell in the pictures online, the presses were made of maple. So that's what I got. Although I tasted it and it tasted nothing like maple. Ugh, yuck. I grabbed a bunch of my 13/16" maple and I carried it over to my miter saw to start cutting it down into smaller, more manageable pieces. Now, the first thing we need to do is glue up some big blocks of wood that we can use as the four legs of the press. So I started ripping down my pieces of maple into leg-width pieces. Once I had enough pieces all cut down to make up my 4 leg blanks, I carried them over to my work table, and now it was time to glue them all together. Now I figured I could glue all these up at the same time as long as I didn't put glue in between the individual leg glue-ups, or else I'd have one giant leg instead of 4 individual legs. Now this press will get a little wet. You know, apple juice. So I decided to glue it up using Titebond 3, which is rated for more outdoor use. So I started spreading and sprinkling Titebond 3 in every nook and cranny until I had glue squeezed in between all 4 of my legs, and I put them in clamps. Along with my leg blanks, I glued up some smaller blanks that I'll use for the stretcher pieces to connect the legs and create the base for my press. Now, one of the things I ordered from Happy Valley Ranch are these barrel rings, for lack of a better term. They're basically the rings that I'm going to use to create the barrels that'll catch all the apple bits and bobs and, well, allow me to make the juice. There was just one problem. If I cut straight pieces of wood, well, you can see I had a nice tight fit at the front, which I don't really want. I want a little bit of a gap, but they were too wide at the back to fit over the pre-drilled holes. So I went over to the table saw, and after playing around with the angle a little bit, I finally settled on an angle of 12 degrees to cut on both sides of my piece. I ran it through on one side, cut that angle, flipped it around, and cut it on the other side. Now, if you're saying that piece looks a little short, don't worry, this is just a scrap. I'm just trying to figure things out at this point. But now it's small enough on the back to fit over the pre-drilled hole and still leave a little gap on the front for my juice to run through. Happy with those angles, I grabbed a bunch of scrap pieces of maple and I started cutting down just a zillion sticks with a 12-degree angle cut on both sides. Once I had a bunch of pieces cut, then I had to figure out how tall I wanted each of my buckets to be. I had no clue because I was basing this all off of a picture. But if my eye is correct, I think it's right around a foot high. So that's what I'm going with, 12 inches. So after setting up a stop block on my miter saw, I cut down 52 pieces at 12 inches in length. That'll be 26 pieces per bucket, which I know is the right amount because that's how many holes are pre-drilled into each ring. When it's all said and done, it's going to look something like this. But this is hard maple, which means I can't just sink a screw into it without the maple cracking. So I'm going to have to pre-drill every single piece twice, once on the top and once on the bottom. So I set up this quick little jig just using some tape and a magnetic feather board from my table saw. This allowed me to drill a hole in the exact same place on each piece, and in no time I had all 52 pieces pre-drilled, and I was ready for my favorite activity, which was to hand sand each piece until I broke down all the edges and they were nice and smooth. But that didn't take too long because off camera I really made Craig do all the sanding. Then all that was left to do was to screw my individual barrel staves to my little metal barrel rings. This took a while, but it was really fun to see the barrel start to take shape. I mean, I know all I did was cut a bunch of straight pieces of wood and screw them to some pre-made barrel rings, but still, it's really starting to look like something out of that picture on my computer. I can taste that apple juice already. In no time, I had not one but two barrels completely assembled and ready for the press. Ooh, squish, 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 squish. Ooh, trickle, trickle, trickle. Yum, yum, yum. Yeah, I think those are gonna work. With those done, my glue up for my legs was dry, so I went back over, took it out of clamps, and persuaded each leg to come apart into its individual pieces. Now yes, I am marring up the legs pretty bad, just whacking it with a chisel, but I'm going to plane all these down to their final dimension here in just a minute, so don't get too cranky. I also separated out my littler blanks, and then I took them over to the joiner. This allowed me to get two perfectly flat and square sides, and then after I was done with the joiner, all I had to do was run them through the planer on the opposite sides and bring them down to their final dimension, which was right around 3 3/4 of an inch. Next, I went over to the miter saw and I chopped the ends off. I didn't really need to do this because I didn't cut them to the right length yet. I just really wanted to make them look all pretty. And they were. Beautiful, hard maple. Now here's one of the parts I got on the internet. This is what's going to hold the big screw turny wheel press thing that's going to actually squish the apples. And I have to mount that in between two of the legs. So I took the dimensions off of that piece of cast steel and I started marking out my legs so that I could add some recesses for that piece to sit, as well as a support to span the legs on the bottom. Now again, I'm not sure of the exact dimensions of anything because I'm basing this all off of what I saw online. So every once in a while I had to kind of hold the parts up to the legs and make sure everything was going to fit the way it should. There basically needs to be enough room underneath this metal piece to fit my bucket and still allow it to sit on that lower support. Pretty confident that my measurements were somewhere in the ballpark. I went over to my dado saw and I started cutting some dados to hold everything together. I won't show you the entire process, but believe me when I say there was a lot of back and forth, testing the fit on parts and pieces, taking a little bit more off, testing it again, taking a little bit more off, testing it again until I got everything to fit just right. Once I had that cast steel piece in the top, I could take my measurements on the bottom and cut that lower support piece. Is it cast steel or cast iron? I mean, I know cast iron is what people usually say, but I really think it's steel. Is there a difference between iron and steel? What do I know? I'm a woodworker. Anyways, it was back over to my dado saw to cut more dados for that lower support. Now this is an antique design. As far as I could tell with my research on the internet, presses like this have been around literally for hundreds of years. So I thought it would be a shame to use something like the Festool domino joiner to hook it together. So I'm going with traditional, mortise and tenon for lack of a better term. It's just a open-ended mortise and tenon. Really just a giant dado that I shoved the full width of the leg into. But pretty soon I had my front leg all cut to the correct size and shape. Now on the bottom of these cast iron pieces are these little indentations. that's supposed to fit a support that'll run to the back legs and hold up my masher component. So I measured off of those front little recesses onto my back legs, and I marked where I needed to put the supports on my back leg assembly. Then it was once again back over to the dado saw to remove a bunch more material so that I had a place for my back leg supports to recess into the legs. Once I had everything cut out and fitting nice and snug, I could cut those back leg supports to the right size so that my back legs were exactly the same width as the span of my front legs. Here's where it started to get a little complicated, because I'm just guessing on a lot of this. I'm pretty sure that these notches have to be level with the top of my back brace piece so that the supports can be recessed into that back brace piece and still fit under that front steel piece. So I have to cut some more dados in that upper support on the back, and I have to cut some pieces that are going to fit inside that steel and recess into that back support. Did any of that make any sense? It'll all make sense in a second when you actually see it. In an effort to reduce the amount of glue-ups I had to do, I decided to use this 10-quarter maple for all my support bracing. So I did a little zip, I did a little zap, I did a little zoop, and I did a little more zipping, and pretty soon I had some pieces milled up that should fit right underneath this steel piece. Eventually they'll get bolted to that steel piece and they'll connect the front leg assembly to the back leg assembly. I also decided to add a stretcher on the lower leg supports to really triangulate the support on the entire thing and make it as sturdy as possible. So I marked out where I needed to cut dados on all my connecting pieces, went back over to the dado saw, and I was finally ready to start gluing everything together. I think. But what do I know? Now, to glue everything together, I decided to take it up a notch and use something really sturdy. And by that, I mean Total Boat Thixo. My thought process was, if this stuff's good enough for water, it's gotta be good enough for apple juice. So I locked in a canister and started squirting it in all my cracks and crevices on the apple press. Pretty soon I had my front leg assembly all put together with Thixo, and I stuck some clamps on it. And then I just set it aside. I went through the exact same process with the back leg assembly. The only difference was it had a upper and lower support because it didn't have that cast steel piece. So once I got that all Thixo'd up and put in clamps, I set that aside, and now I just had to wait for them to dry. But not being one to stand around with my hands in my pockets, I decided while I waited for those to dry, I needed to build some sort of tray on the lower section of my press to catch all the juice. So I measured the distance between my legs on my leg assembly, then I went over to the table saw and ripped down a bunch of maple. Then I went back over and I measured the distance between my legs on my leg assembly, because I'd already forgotten from when I measured the first time. Then it was over to the miter saw to start cutting down pieces. Again, I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm kind of making this part up as I go along. But all I really needed was a tray that would hold these two buckets and hold juice. At least I think that's all I need. So using the buckets as a reference, I started cutting the pieces to what I thought was the right size and shape and laying them out for assembly on my outfeed table. But then I realized that a square end to this tray might not be the best design. Looking at the pictures online, the lower tray always comes to almost a point, and my guess is that's so that the juice can be directed to a central hole that then drains out into some sort of collection device. So I started chopping up the front of my tray and making it more angular. Hopefully this will help direct the juice to the right spot. But now that I have all these weird angles cut, I had another problem. How the heck am I going to join these together? They're too weird to really get a domino joiner on there, and I already said I didn't want to use dominoes because this is kind of an antique project. So I opted for splines. Now if you've never used splines to connect weird angles like this, it's pretty darn easy. I just drew a line where I wanted my spline to be. I set my fence and my table saw blade height, and I very carefully ran the pieces through the table saw. Now these are just test pieces to see if it'll work. Now I have this nice line that connects one angle to the other, and all I have to do is fill that with a piece of wood, or a spline. Pretty happy with my blade height and distance away from the fence. I took all of my pieces over and I started very carefully running them through that blade. As you can see, you got some awkward cuts that you have to make doing it this way, but as long as you go slow, I'm convinced you can still do it safe and accurately. With all the mortises cut for my splines, now all I have to do is cut the splines themselves and insert them into the holes. Since the splines are going to be visible, I thought it would be cool to use a contrasting wood color. And I had this piece of mahogany laying around, so after resawing it down so it was a little thinner on the bandsaw, I took it over to the planer and I thinned it down even more. Now these have to be a precise thickness, so I finished it off on the drum sander, making little pass by little pass until I had a nice tight fit in my pre-cut grooves on my pieces. The nice thing about splines is not only will they add a ton of strength to your joint, they'll also help with alignment so that when you go to clamp this joint up, it's not going to be slipping and sliding all over the place. I test fit the splines into their grooves and they fit perfect. But before I glued up the front end, I thought I might as well get the back end glued up so it wasn't flopping all over the place while I was trying to deal with those angles at the front. Now the back is a lot easier because it's just some butt joints. I figured the strongest way to hook these pieces together would be screws, but I drilled some holes so that I can fill those holes with plugs later that I'll make out of mahogany and it'll match the splines on the front. So with those holes drilled, I added some Thixo in between my butt joint and I clamped the whole thing together. After pre-drilling, I screwed it in place and pretty soon the back end was all locked and loaded and ready to go. Time to assemble that front end. Now normally gluing and clamping angles like this is a total pain because they don't want to stay put. But as I mentioned before, the splines make all of that go away because once you insert the spline into its hole, it kind of locks the whole thing together and it can't slip and slide around, which is really nice. Pretty soon I had splines in all the joints and all I had to do was clamp it up. With that and clamps, I decided to cut some plugs to fill those screw holes. I'm going to be using the CMT plug cutter. I have these available for sale on my website and they work fantastic. There's a link down below in the video description. I just grabbed another scrap piece of mahogany and started plugging away. Literally. After I had the plugs cut out with the plug cutter, I went over to the bandsaw and I freed them from their holes so that I could permanently glue them in another hole. Poor plugs. I was on a Thixo kick, so why not just keep it up? I smeared a little Thixo on the end of each plug, inserted it into the hole, and I tap-a-roo with the hammer. I'll come back and flush cut these later, and you'll never know there's screws under there.
I feel like I'm getting older. I wake up in the morning, my body's sore, it's harder to get out of bed, and I have to be more responsible. Apparently you gotta do that when you grow up, which I don't love. But one thing I do love is that it's easy to be responsible with Policy Genius because I can find a life insurance policy and make sure my family is taken care of, and it's not a huge headache. They make it incredibly easy to find the policy that's right for you. All you gotta do is, well, all this stuff.
You see, with Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options even offer same-day approval and avoid all the unnecessary medical exams. Their licensed award-winning agents can help you find the best fit for your needs. They work for you, not the insurance companies. That means they don't have an incentive to recommend one insurer over another. They just want you to get the best policy at the best price.
Now, you might be thinking, all that sounds amazing, I love it, but what do I do next? Where do I go from here? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that part is incredibly easy. You just do this.
Your loved ones deserve a financial safety net, and you deserve a smarter way to find and buy it. So head to policygenius.com/bourbonmoth or just click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save.
I'm telling you guys, Policy Genius makes it incredibly simple. So check the link in the video description and go find the policy that's right for you. Huge thanks to Policy Genius. for sponsoring this video.
With my juice tray well underway, I had to tackle another juice flow issue. Now, if these buckets sit right on the bottom of the tray, it's going to make it harder for that juice to flow. So I need a tray that sits on top of the tray so that the bucket can sit on that, if that makes any sense. So using my buckets as a size reference, I cut down a bunch of pieces of hard maple about a 1/2 inch thick and 3/4 inch wide, and then I cut down a bunch of little spacer pieces about 1/8 of an inch wide so that I could space out all my 1/2 inch pieces and, make them look nice and uniform. I also clamped a nice straight edge on the front of my outfeed table so that I could assemble everything against that and make sure it was all lined up nice and pretty. To hook these together, I'm going super simple. I cut a few support pieces to put crossways on the bottom, and I added a little Titebond 3. And I mean a little, just a dollop of glue on each individual slat. Then I set that support piece on top, and I just added a staple in each slat to hold my support piece firmly on there. I figured between that and the glue, it's got a pretty good chance of surviving against the onslaught of apple juice, which is in its future. I added 3 supports on the bottom of each tray. I think those should be plenty strong, and it should raise those buckets off of my lower tray enough to allow that juice to flow freely. Now, because I made 2 buckets, I did have to make 2 trays, and I quickly realized that square trays just weren't going to work because the front of my lower tray has that angled nose. So I took my other trays over to my first tray, and I used that as a reference to mark where I needed to cut my second trays, trivets, whatever you want to call these things. And now they should fit nicely under my buckets and in that lower tray. By that time, my leg assembly was all dry and ready to be taken out of clamps. So I removed the clamps and I gave it a nice sanding to get rid of any extra Thixo that I had accidentally smeared on the outside. My lower juice tray was also dry, so I took that out of clamps. I flush trimmed and sanded all of those plugs, and now I was ready to start thinking about hooking my back leg assembly to my front leg assembly. Now I had to wait until this lower tray was done because I needed to be able to use it as a size reference and space out those legs accordingly. So I just set my lower stretcher in place, and I set the outer frame of my lower tray in place, as well as these little trivets I made. Hey, trays and trivets. That's how I'll define the two. Next, I set my buckets on top of my trivets inside of my tray, and this allowed me to figure out how far out I needed to space the back and front leg assembly. You see, the front leg has to be right above this bucket so that the smasher thing works. And then the back legs, well, they have to be able to hold these supports and also hold the apple eater, which is this thing. At least I just like to call it the apple eater because it's supposed to smash up and, well, eat the apples before they get pressed. There was a slight issue when I went to set the apple eater in. As you can see, it needs to be resting on those supports up by that axle. So I had to carve out a little bit of material so that it would sit down in between those. So I took the supports off, went back over to the dado saw, a little zip, a little zap, a little zoop. I removed some material, stuck those support pieces back in place, and now if all goes well, my apple eater should fit where it's supposed to, which I'm happy to report it did. So with everything where it should be, generally, and the front legs and the back legs spaced out correctly for the buckets and the tray down below, I marked where everything was supposed to go. Now all the metal pieces are going to be bolted in place, so I had to mark where I needed to pre-drill holes to accommodate those bolts. So I did that on the top and on the bottom and the sides and the front and the back. There was a lot of places to mark. Once I had everything marked, I took apart all the supports, I went over to my drill press, and I pre-drilled all of those holes so that I should be able to slide bolts in there later. The only part that I couldn't fit inside the drill press was the bolts that are going to go through the side of the legs to hold that front press assembly. So I just did that by hand, but it wasn't too bad. Then it was time to squirt on some more Thixo and actually glue the front leg assembly to the back leg assembly with those connecting support pieces. While I waited for all of that to dry, I decided to address a major design flaw that I noticed with my lower tray. There's a giant hole in it. All the juice is just going to leak out onto the floor. So I had to add a bottom to my tray. I went over to my router table and using a Bits and Bits Astra-coated rabbiting bit, I rabbited a nice 3/4 inch deep by 1/2 inch rabbit around the bottom side of my tray. It looked something like this. With my rabbit cut, I took the measurements both for length and width, and then I went over to the table saw and I cut down a 3/4 inch thick piece of Baltic birch plywood. Yes, plywood, because, well, it's easy. And, well, I had some plywood over in the corner and I thought, oh, that'll work, so I grabbed it. Then I set the tray frame on top of the piece of plywood. I traced out the shape of that rabbit that I just cut, and using a combination of the miter saw and my oscillating belt sander, I shaped that lower piece to the right shape so that it would slide into that tray assembly. But before I did that, I gooped up that whole inner lip with some Thixo. Now this is both to glue that plywood base in place and also seal up that plywood edge so that it doesn't get exposed to moisture and make that plywood want to start popping apart. So, using an ample amount of Thixo on that groove, I slid the plywood in, and then just to be safe, I added a nice little bead of Thixo around the inside so that juice can't run down into that crack and mess with the plywood. Is this overkill? Probably, but better safe than sorry. Am I right? Now because I'm using the fast cure Thixo, by the time I was done with the tray base, my glue was dry on my leg assembly, so I could go over there and start actually bolting on all my metal parts and pieces. So using a hammer for a little persuasion, yes, I did put a giant dent in the side of my leg, sorry, I was able to get all of my metal pieces bolted on and tightened down. Now this is where I started to go a little rogue. Now, the original design for this apple eater is to put this giant wheel on the end. You spin the wheel around, it rotates the apple eating device, and it crushes your apples. But that just seemed like so much work, and I'm lazy. So I decided to take this wheel off, and then I just happened to have this little AC motor laying around. I figured, why not hook this up with a belt to the apple eater and just make it do all the work? And I actually found a conversion kit to do this on the same website I bought all the metal pieces from for the press. So I bought this little wheel, and I was almost ready to rock and roll. There was only one problem. The motor I had spun in the wrong direction. So after doing a little bit of research on YouTube, I just took the motor apart, rewired it, switched a few leads around, and reversed the direction of the motor until it was moving in the right direction for my setup, and hopefully can turn the wheel the way that I want it to go. There's also a little issue of where to mount the motor, because if I mounted it back here, this belt was going to rub, but I really didn't want to mount it off the side. So all I had to do was raise the motor up a little bit. So I milled up a piece of that 10-quarter maple, and I thought if I just glued this on the back and set the motor on top, that should give me enough clearance for that belt to move freely, which it did. But obviously before I hook any of this in place, there's a few more things I needed to do. Like cut these long support pieces to length. Why I didn't cut these to length before I glued them in there, I'm not quite sure. I just didn't. So a little zip zap zoop with the handsaw, and they were, ta-da, cut to the right length. Same thing on that bottom support. Just cut it to the right size before you glue it up, silly. With those cut to the right length, I smeared on yet more Thixo, and I glued on my little block for my motor to sit on. And then I discovered another issue. At this point, my lower tray is level, which means that there's not going to be any flow for that juice to come towards the front. So I had to figure out some way to raise the tray up in the back so that the juice would actually flow forward. So I cut this little tiny wedge out of some scrap maple. And I thought if I just stick this wedge under here like this and glue it down like that, Then I can use that to determine the direction of the tray, and all I'll have to do is bolt it in the back, and I'll have some nice slope towards the front. Now it's really important that that front is in perfect contact with my support, because there's going to be a ton of weight coming down from the press. Hence the need for the wedge. I couldn't just have a little gap under there, or it might blow out the plywood. So I squirted some more Thixo on, I stuck my wedge in place, and I clamped it down. Now while I was on the internet looking for the conversion kit to turn this into a motorized apple eater, I saw that they sell these little bearings that go on the outside of this axle. I thought that was probably a good idea, considering this thing's going to be spinning a lot faster than normal, so I made some little blocks and a place for those to be attached. But before I attached them, I had to finish this entire thing. And by finish, I mean actually put a coat of finish on it, not complete it. Now this thing is going to be used to make apple juice, which is going to go inside my body. So I didn't want to use some toxic finish that wasn't food safe. So I opted for just plain Jane mineral oil, because mineral oil is safe to consume. They actually prescribe it as a laxative, in case you wanted to know. So I loaded up a spray bottle with a bunch of mineral oil, and I coated my floor with sawdust. Not because I'm crazy, because I didn't want to get my floor all oily, and the sawdust worked just as well as a drop cloth. Then I just started spritzing the entire thing with a heavy layer of mineral oil, letting it soak in, spritzing it a little more, letting it soak in, and then spritzing it a little more. Pretty soon I had the entire thing coated in an ample amount of mineral oil, and I was finally ready to assemble it. So I grabbed this big press screw component and I threaded it into place. And that's when I realized this thing's really hard to turn because it's so dinky and tiny. Look at this. And that's when I had an idea. Because I wasn't going to use this giant wheel to turn the apple eater, I thought, what if I somehow hook this onto this thingy-mabob and make it a lot easier to turn around? So I just clamped it on top, and then because this is cast steel, it's actually fairly soft. So I was able to drill holes through the wheel and through the top of that twisty turny thing and just bolt it in place. Easy peasy, apple squeezy. The wheel even came with this maple handle, which made turning it that much easier. I think I'm really up to something here. People are going to start doing this. I may have just reinvented the wheel on the apple press. With that attached, I bolted my little motor in place, and because I didn't need this extra length sticking out on this little axle, I just cut it off with my reciprocating saw. Filed it down a little bit so it wasn't sharp, and that motor looks like it was always meant to be there. I raised up the back end of my tray to get that nice slope that I was talking about, drilled some countersunk holes, and added some stainless steel fasteners to secure it in place. I did the same thing at the front, this time on the base of the tray, and I added a little Thixo to those holes before I inserted the fasteners, just to make sure that no juice was going to leak out. Speaking of juice leaking out, I almost forgot to drill a hole at the front of the tray so that the juice could actually leak out. So I drilled one with a Forstner bit coming in from both sides so I wouldn't have any blowout, and then I added a little Thixo around the inside of that hole to seal off that exposed plywood. I also made this little round thing to go into the masher, but I forgot to film that part. Now this might be overkill, but I did add stainless steel lag screws through all those joints just to make extra sure that this thing was rock solid and not going anywhere. And then the final thing I did was add these workbench removable casters that would allow the thing to be raised and lowered if you needed to move it around. And with that, the apple press was done. Pretty impressive, if you know what I mean. There was really just one thing left to do, and that was to test it out and see if it'd work. So I walked out the door of my shop and over to our apple trees, and me and Craig started picking. And picking. And when I say we picked a lot of apples, I mean, well, we picked a lot of apples. Like a ton of apples. Like a ridiculous amount of apples were picked. Because if you're gonna do a thing, you might as well really do a thing. So I brought the apple press out, I lowered it down, it was nice and sturdy, and we got to work. I was really curious to see if my electric apple eater would work the way that it's supposed to. Oh my gosh, this thing's awesome. It literally destroys apples. Bear attack. So let me break it down for you. You feed apples in the apple eater as fast as you can. It eats them up and spits them down into the bucket below in a bunch of mush that's ready to be pressed. Once you get enough apples in the bucket to fill it up, you slide the bucket forward underneath the actual pressing device. Then you stick in this little wooden topper so you get a nice even press, and you crank the press down until it starts creating pressure and the apple juice starts flowing out. Liquid gold. Look at all that deliciousness. And then you just keep doing this over and over again until you got a good amount of apple cider. While it's pressing in the front, you can be crushing apples in the back, for productivity. And I have to say, if you've never had cider straight out of an apple press, well, you're missing out, because this stuff is pretty darn delicious. I like to use a mixture of apples, different kinds, and I got a couple pear trees, so we just threw those in as well. It really didn't take that long to start raking in the apple cider. In no time, we had 25 gallons of it. And for those of you wondering what I did with all the leftover apple pulp, don't worry, it didn't go to waste. I just wheeled it over to my neighbor's cows, dumped it in the field, and they were very happy to have the little treat. They just weren't very happy that I was in their pasture.
Oh, hi. Hey, look, we did it. 25 gallons of cider in like 2.5 hours. That's pretty darn good. With a little press I threw together in my shop. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I can see myself pressing apples well into my 60s. And drinking them too. And if I'm drinking that much apple juice, well, I'm probably gonna live to be like 150. That's a lot more pressing. Anyways, hope you enjoyed that video. Check out all the links down in the video description to all the parts and pieces we used. You can basically click on those links and build your own press with everything that's down there. Also, there's a link to our Patreon page. There's a link to our website if you want some sweet new merch or plans. By the way, we do have plans available for this press down there somewhere. So give it a peruse and tune in next time for another video. Maybe we'll press grapes or bananas. Ooh.